Daniel Carter had faced pirates, mercenaries, and warlords across half the galaxy, but nothing confused him more than the alien queen who kept running away every time he entered the room. Queen Lasara ruled a star empire and stood nearly 8 feet tall with luminous blue skin, yet the moment their eyes met she would turn and disappear like she'd seen a ghost. One night the station lost power, and the two of them were trapped alone in a dark elevator barely 6 feet wide. Her breathing grew faster, her skin shifting colors as she pressed against the wall and whispered the truth that made Daniel freeze solid. "I wasn't hiding because I feared you. I was hiding because you are the one being in the universe my species cannot resist. If you ever see an 8-foot alien queen run away from you, don't chase her, because the reason might change your life forever." Daniel Carter learned that lesson the strange way. The first time it happened, he thought it was a mistake. The diplomatic station Aurora hung quietly in orbit above a pale blue gas giant nearly 300,000 miles from the nearest inhabited world, its long corridors humming with recycled air and soft reactor vibrations. Daniel stood outside the grand reception chamber in his dark security uniform, a former Marine trying to look comfortable among ambassadors and scholars from half the galaxy. His job was simple on paper: keep the peace, watch the exits, and make sure no one accidentally started an interstellar incident. Easy work compared to what he used to do. But the moment the chamber doors slid open and Queen Lasara stepped into view, everything went sideways. She was impossible to miss. Nearly 8 feet tall, with luminous blue skin that reflected the station lights like polished glass, and eyes the color of molten gold. The ruler of an empire spanning dozens of star systems, feared by pirates and respected by diplomats alike. Every briefing Daniel had read described her the same way: calm, calculating, impossible to intimidate. Which is why what happened next made absolutely no sense. The instant her gaze landed on him, the queen froze. Not for long, just half a second. But Daniel noticed it. Years of security work trained him to notice tiny things: a shift of posture, a held breath, a heartbeat too quick. Lasara's golden eyes widened just slightly. Then, without a word to the assembled delegates, she turned around and walked straight back out of the chamber. The room fell silent behind her. An ambassador coughed awkwardly. Someone muttered in a language Daniel's translator struggled to identify. Daniel stood there wondering if he had somehow violated an interstellar protocol without realizing it. Maybe humans weren't supposed to stand in certain places during royal entrances. Maybe eye contact meant something different to her species. He checked his uniform out of habit. Everything was in order. Nothing offensive, nothing unusual. Yet the queen had looked at him like she'd just spotted a dangerous animal loose in the room. Later that day, Daniel watched the security feed again just to be sure he hadn't imagined it. The footage confirmed everything. The queen entered confidently, surrounded by advisors. Then her eyes locked on him across a distance of about 30 feet. Her steps stopped. Her posture stiffened. And then she left. The strangest part was what happened after. The next time their paths crossed in a corridor nearly a quarter-mile long, Lasara saw him coming from the opposite direction. Instead of continuing forward like any normal person would, the most powerful monarch in that sector of the galaxy quietly turned into a side hallway and disappeared. Daniel Carter had survived combat zones, diplomatic standoffs, and the chaos of first contact missions. But nothing in his training explained why the alien queen of a star empire seemed determined to avoid one completely ordinary human security officer. At first he assumed it was coincidence. By the 4th time, he knew it wasn't. Daniel Carter had been on Aurora Station for 3 weeks before he realized the pattern was not random. At first he told himself it was coincidence. A busy diplomatic station, nearly 2 miles wide, had hundreds of corridors, observation decks, research wings, and docking rings. People changed direction all the time. Meetings ended early. Routes shifted. Schedules changed. But Queen Lasara never simply happened to leave a room. She left specifically when he arrived. The 3rd time it happened, he was standing near the main observation gallery, watching the pale blue gas giant slowly rotate beneath the station. The massive planet filled nearly half the window, swirling clouds stretching thousands of miles across the atmosphere like brush strokes on a cosmic canvas. Aurora Station orbited high enough that the planet looked calm and distant, but the gravitational pull still made the structure vibrate faintly through the floor panels. Daniel liked the observation deck because it was quiet. No diplomats arguing over trade treaties. No scientists debating research permits. Just the low hum of the station and the endless view of space. He was halfway through a cup of terrible station coffee when the elevator doors opened behind him. The soft mechanical chime echoed through the glass chamber. Daniel glanced over his shoulder out of habit, the way every security officer did. And there she was again. Queen Lasara stepped out of the elevator surrounded by two advisors with shimmering silver tablets in their hands. Even standing 20 feet away, she was impossible to ignore. The station lighting reflected across her luminous blue skin, creating faint ripples of light along her arms and neck like reflections across water. Her posture was straight and regal, every movement controlled and deliberate. The advisors were speaking quickly in a language Daniel could not identify, their translator implants flickering faintly as they recorded the conversation. For about 2 seconds, everything looked normal. Then Lasara looked up and saw him. The reaction was immediate. Her golden eyes widened slightly. Her advisors kept talking, unaware anything had changed. But Daniel saw the Queen inhale slowly, as if the air had suddenly grown heavier. For a brief moment their eyes met across the observation deck. 30 feet of polished metal floor separated them. Daniel lifted his hand politely, unsure what else to do. The Queen turned away instantly. Not slowly. Not awkwardly. Instantly. She pivoted with surprising speed for someone nearly 8 feet tall, and stepped back into the elevator before her advisors even realized she had stopped walking. The doors closed with a quiet hiss. The advisors stood there for a full second staring at the empty hallway where their ruler had been standing. One of them blinked in confusion before hurrying after her. Daniel remained by the window holding his coffee, watching the elevator indicator drop 3 floors. He waited a few seconds, then took a slow sip and stared out at the gas giant again. That was when he accepted something important. The Queen was not accidentally leaving rooms. She was avoiding him. The question was why. Daniel Carter was not a diplomat, but he understood people well enough to recognize fear when he saw it. Except that was the strange part. Queen Lasara did not look afraid of him. She looked like someone who had just realized standing too close to a fire might burn her. And the most confusing detail of all was that Daniel Carter had absolutely no idea what he had done to make the most powerful alien queen in that star system treat him like a dangerous problem. By midday, the entire diplomatic wing of Aurora Station had heard about the incident in the corridor. Rumors traveled through a space station faster than cargo shipments. And when the ruler of a multi-system empire canceled a council meeting, without explanation, people started asking questions. Daniel Carter heard those questions the moment he stepped into the security operations room. The room stretched nearly 60 feet across, lined with wall-length displays showing camera feeds from every major corridor, docking bay, and observation deck aboard the station. Officers sat at curved consoles watching streams of data while quiet conversations filled the air. The moment Daniel walked in, 2 of the technicians exchanged a glance. One of them leaned back in his chair and gave Daniel a long, curious look. Daniel recognized the expression immediately. It was the same look people gave a mechanic when an engine exploded right after he touched it. Daniel walked over to the coffee machine and poured himself a cup of something that technically counted as coffee, but tasted closer to heated metal. Before he could take a sip, Lieutenant Marissa Cole approached from across the room, holding a tablet under her arm. Marissa had worked station security for nearly 10 years, and nothing surprised her easily, which made the slight smirk on her face even more noticeable. She stopped beside Daniel and folded her arms. Daniel did not look up from his cup. He already knew what question was coming. The lieutenant tilted her head slightly and said in a calm voice, "Would you like to explain why the Queen of the Salari Dominion just canceled an interstellar council meeting the moment she saw you standing in a hallway?" Daniel took a slow drink before answering. "I was standing there. That is the full explanation." Marissa raised one eyebrow. "Daniel, you do realize that meeting included representatives from 9 systems and 2 trade alliances. They waited 40 minutes in that conference room. Then the Queen's advisors informed them the meeting had been postponed indefinitely." Daniel leaned against the counter and shrugged slightly. Then maybe she had something important come up. Marissa stared at him for a few seconds, clearly deciding whether he was joking. Then she tapped the tablet screen and turned it toward him. The display showed a security recording from the diplomatic corridor earlier that morning. The video angle clearly showed Lasara approaching with her advisors. Daniel standing near the column. The Queen stopping. The brief pause. Then the sudden decision to turn around. Marissa watched Daniel's face carefully. That is the 4th time in 3 days she has changed direction because you were in the room. Daniel blinked slowly. You are counting. Security counts everything. She lowered the tablet slightly and studied him with open curiosity. So tell me something honestly. Did you insult her somehow? Did you violate some cultural rule during first contact protocol? Daniel shook his head. I have never spoken to her. That answer actually made Marissa pause. She frowned slightly and glanced back at the video. The image froze on the exact moment Lasara noticed Daniel across the corridor. The Queen's golden eyes were fixed directly on him. Marissa leaned closer to the screen. That is not the expression of someone who is angry. Daniel followed her gaze. What does it look like then? Marissa hesitated for a moment before answering quietly. Honestly, it looks like someone who is trying very hard not to walk closer. Daniel stared at the screen again, replaying the moment in his mind. The slowed step, the measured breath, the sudden retreat. For the first time since arriving on Aurora Station, he began to suspect that whatever was happening had nothing to do with diplomacy, politics, or security protocols. Something about his mere presence was affecting the alien Queen in a way neither of them fully understood. Daniel Carter spent the rest of the afternoon pretending the situation was not strange, which would have been easier if half the station had not started watching him like he carried a secret they wanted to solve. Aurora Station rotated slowly against the backdrop of space, the massive gas giant below filling the observation windows with endless blue clouds stretching thousands of miles across the planet's atmosphere. Inside the station, the temperature stayed a steady 72 degrees Fahrenheit, and the recycled air smelled faintly of metal. And sterilized filters, the quiet background rhythm of a structure that never truly slept. Daniel finished his shift in the security operations room around 6 in the evening and stepped out into the central promenade, a circular corridor nearly half a mile long that connected the residential quarters, research wings, and diplomatic halls. Soft white lights lined the ceiling panels, reflecting off polished floors while travelers from a dozen worlds moved calmly between shops, cafes, and information kiosks. Normally Daniel liked this part of the station. It reminded him that the galaxy was larger than the narrow life he had lived before joining interstellar security. But today the comfortable routine felt different because his mind kept replaying the same image over and over again. The moment Queen Lasara saw him across that hallway and stopped like she had just reached an invisible boundary. Daniel stopped beside a glass railing overlooking the lower level of the promenade and rested his hands on the cool metal edge. 2 floors below, a group of engineers were discussing reactor maintenance while a family of visitors from a distant colony examined a holographic star map that floated nearly 10 feet wide above the floor. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. Yet somewhere on the station, the most powerful alien monarch in that sector of space was apparently reorganizing her entire schedule to avoid standing within 30 feet of him. Daniel shook his head slightly, trying to laugh at the absurdity of it. He was not special. He was not important. He was a 6-foot-tall human security officer from Earth who spent most of his career guarding cargo docks and escorting visiting diplomats to conference rooms. Nothing about him should have triggered that kind of reaction. A quiet mechanical chime interrupted his thoughts. The elevator at the end of the promenade opened with its usual soft hiss. Daniel did not look immediately. After the last few days, he had learned that turning around too quickly sometimes caused exactly the situation he was trying to avoid. But the subtle change in the atmosphere of the corridor told him everything he needed to know. Conversations lowered. Footsteps slowed. People shifted slightly to the side of the walkway. Daniel sighed quietly and turned his head. Queen Lasara had stepped out of the elevator again. This time she was alone. No advisors. No ceremonial guard. Just the towering alien. Queen walking calmly into the open promenade where hundreds of civilians moved through the station. The distance between them was roughly 40 feet. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. Daniel felt a familiar tension settle in his chest because he already knew what was about to happen. The Queen's golden eyes lifted and met his across the wide corridor. The reaction was exactly the same as before. Her shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. Her breathing slowed. Daniel watched her carefully this time. determined to understand what he was seeing. It was not fear. It was restraint, as if she was forcing herself to remain exactly where she stood. Daniel straightened slightly and gave a polite nod across the distance. For the first time since arriving on Aurora Station, Queen Lasara did not turn away immediately. She remained where she was, standing perfectly still in the center of the promenade, while the quiet noise of the station flowed around them like water around two unmoving stones. For several seconds the promenade remained strangely quiet around them. Daniel Carter stood near the glass railing while Queen Lasara remained in the center of the corridor roughly 40 feet away, her tall silhouette framed by the soft white lights above. Travelers moved cautiously around the edges of the walkway, careful not to interrupt whatever silent moment had formed between a human security officer and the ruler of a distant star empire. Daniel had spent enough years reading people to understand when someone was deciding something important, and that was exactly what the queen looked like now. Her golden eyes remained fixed on him with an intensity that made the distance between them feel much shorter than 40 feet. Daniel noticed small details he had missed before. The faint rise and fall of her shoulders as she breathed slowly through her chest. The slight tightening of her hands at her sides, as if she was concentrating on holding perfectly still. Even the subtle shift in the color of her luminous blue skin seemed to ripple slightly along her arms under the station lights. It reminded Daniel of someone standing near the edge of a swimming pool, deciding whether the water was too cold to step into. Finally, he did the simplest thing possible. He spoke. His voice was calm and respectful, loud enough to carry across the corridor without forcing anyone nearby to stop. What they were doing. Your Majesty, if I have somehow violated a cultural protocol, I would appreciate knowing so I can correct the mistake. The words echoed softly through the open space. For a moment Lasara did not answer. Her gaze remained steady on him, studying him with the same careful attention she had shown during every encounter over the past few days. Then something changed. Slowly, almost cautiously, the queen took a single step forward. The movement caused several nearby pedestrians to freeze mid-stride, unsure whether they should continue walking or retreat completely out of the area. Daniel stayed where he was. Another step followed. The distance between them shrank from 40 feet to roughly 35. Lasara stopped again, her expression controlled but no longer distant. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a low melodic tone that Daniel's translator rendered clearly in his ear. Human Daniel Carter, you have committed no offense against my people. Daniel blinked slightly. Hearing his full name spoken in that calm royal voice made the situation feel even more surreal. Then why do you keep leaving every room the moment I enter it? The question hung between them in the open corridor. The queen's eyes shifted briefly to the floor before returning to him. Daniel noticed that the subtle ripple of color along her blue skin had grown slightly brighter, almost like faint light passing under the surface. Lasara inhaled slowly again, the movement deep enough that Daniel could hear it from across the space between them. The answer she gave was quiet, but unmistakably sincere. Because remaining near you is difficult. Daniel stared at her for a moment, certain he had misunderstood something in translation. Difficult in what way? The queen hesitated. For the first time since he had seen her, the absolute confidence that defined her posture seemed to soften slightly. She glanced briefly toward the surrounding promenade, as if measuring how many people might overhear the conversation. Then her eyes returned to Daniel with an expression that looked almost conflicted. That is not a conversation meant for the center of a crowded station corridor. Daniel followed her glance. Dozens of curious onlookers had slowed their pace, pretending not to listen while very obviously listening. The queen straightened again, returning to her composed royal posture. There is a private council chamber 2 levels above this promenade. If you are willing, human Daniel Carter, we should speak there. Daniel considered the offer for exactly 2 seconds. Then he nodded once. After 3 days of unanswered questions, he was not about to refuse the first real explanation the alien queen had offered. The elevator ride to the upper council level lasted only 12 seconds, but to Daniel Carter it felt longer. The small chamber was silent except for the soft mechanical hum of the lift traveling through the station's central column. The space measured roughly 8 feet by 8 feet, which meant that with Queen Lasara standing beside him the room suddenly felt much smaller than it actually was. Daniel kept his posture relaxed, hands loosely at his sides the way he had learned during years of security duty. But he could not ignore the quiet tension filling the elevator. Lasara stood almost perfectly still near the opposite wall, her luminous blue skin reflecting faint light from the overhead panel. Daniel noticed again that the subtle shifting colors across her arms were stronger now, faint ripples of pale silver moving beneath the surface like reflections across water. He wondered briefly if that was normal for her species, or if it had something to do with him being 3 feet away. The elevator slowed gently before the doors opened with a quiet hiss. The upper council level was far quieter than the busy promenade below. This part of Aurora Station was reserved for private diplomatic discussions and sensitive negotiations, so the corridors were wide, softly lit, and mostly empty. Frosted glass panels lined the walls while small recessed lights created a calm atmosphere that felt closer to a library than a government building. Lasara stepped out first and moved down the hallway with long, controlled strides, her tall frame passing under the curved ceiling lights with effortless grace. Daniel followed a few steps behind, noticing that the Queen kept exactly the same distance between them the entire time. Roughly 10 feet. Not closer, not farther, just enough space that the air between them felt deliberate. They reached a sealed chamber door marked Council Room 3. The door recognized Lasara's presence immediately and slid open without a sound. The room beyond was spacious, nearly 40 feet across, with a circular table in the center surrounded by tall chairs designed for several different alien physiologies. A wide observation window filled one side of the chamber, revealing the enormous blue gas giant below the station. From this altitude, the planet looked endless, swirling clouds stretching thousands of miles across its atmosphere, while faint lightning flickered silently deep within the storm layers. Lasara stepped inside and stopped near the center of the room. Daniel entered behind her, and the door closed softly, sealing them away from the rest of the station. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet inside the chamber was different from the silence of the corridor. It felt heavier, more focused, as if the room itself understood that whatever was about to be said mattered. Daniel walked slowly toward the circular table and rested one hand on the smooth surface. So he said calmly, "You mentioned that being near me is difficult." The Queen remained standing across the table, her golden eyes studying him with the same intense focus she had shown since the first day they crossed paths. "Yes," she replied softly. Daniel waited for her to continue, but she did not speak immediately. Instead, she turned slightly toward the observation window and stared down at the massive planet below them. When she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet weight that made the words feel carefully chosen. "Human Daniel Carter, my species has studied many civilizations across the galaxy. We have encountered thousands of biological variations, hundreds of different evolutionary paths, and countless forms of intelligence." Daniel nodded slowly, unsure where the explanation was going. Lasara continued without looking at him. "But there are still aspects of life that remain unpredictable." She turned back toward him then, and Daniel immediately noticed that the faint glow beneath her blue skin had grown brighter again. "I did not expect to encounter one of those unpredictable things here on this station." Daniel frowned slightly. "I am not sure I understand what you mean." For the first time since the conversation began, the alien Queen looked genuinely uncertain about how to continue. She took a slow breath, her tall shoulders rising and falling once before she finally said the words that had clearly been difficult for her to speak. "The presence of a certain individual can trigger biological responses within my species that we cannot easily ignore." Daniel stared at her across the table. "And you are saying that individual is me?" Lasara did not answer immediately, but the silence in the room was answer enough. Daniel Carter remained silent for several seconds after the Queen's last words, not because he was unsure what to say, but because he wanted to be certain he had understood them correctly. The quiet council chamber felt even larger now, the circular table between them reflecting the soft light from the observation window, while the massive gas giant below slowly rotated beneath the station like a living ocean. Daniel finally leaned back slightly against the edge of the table and folded his arms in a relaxed posture. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," he said calmly. "You are telling me that my presence triggers some kind of biological response in your species." Lasara did not look away from him. "That is correct." Daniel let out a slow breath through his nose, more thoughtful than surprised. He had worked with enough alien cultures over the years to know that biology could create strange misunderstandings between species. Some races communicated through scent, others through electromagnetic pulses. One species from the outer colonies reacted to certain sound frequencies the way humans reacted to caffeine. Still, the way the Queen had been avoiding him suggested something more complicated than a simple chemical reaction. Daniel tilted his head slightly. What kind of response are we talking about? The Queen hesitated again. The subtle shifting light beneath her blue skin brightened along her arms and neck, the color moving in faint ripples like moonlight across water. Daniel noticed that every time the subject moved closer to the real explanation, those glowing patterns became stronger. For my species, she said slowly, certain individuals can trigger what we call a bond instinct. Daniel frowned slightly. Bond instinct? Yes. Lysara's golden eyes remained steady on him. It is an evolutionary mechanism tied to long-term biological compatibility. When our nervous system detects the correct genetic signals, our bodies begin responding automatically. Daniel blinked once. That sounded suspiciously like something far more complicated than a simple instinct. Let me guess, he said carefully. Those signals are extremely rare. The Queen nodded once. Extremely rare. Daniel exhaled slowly and looked toward the massive blue planet outside the window for a moment, trying to organize his thoughts. When he turned back to her, his voice remained calm, but curious. And somehow you are saying that I am producing those signals. The silence that followed was almost comical. In its simplicity, Lysara did not speak immediately. She simply stood there watching him, the faint glow beneath her skin now clearly visible along her shoulders and collarbone under the chamber lights. Finally, she gave a small nod. Yes. Daniel stared at her for a long moment before shaking his head slightly in disbelief. You are the ruler of an interstellar empire, and you are telling me that the reason you keep running away from me is because your biology thinks I am genetically compatible with you. When he said the words out loud, the situation sounded even stranger than it had in his head. Lysara did not appear amused. It is not merely a matter of compatibility, she said quietly. It is considerably more serious than that. Daniel raised one eyebrow. I was afraid you were going to say something like that. The Queen took one slow step closer to the table, reducing the distance between them by a few feet. Her expression remained composed, but the faint ripple of light across her skin grew brighter again. For my species, she continued, when this instinct activates, it does not fade easily. Daniel watched her carefully now. So the reason you have been avoiding me is because you are trying to prevent that instinct from getting stronger. Yes. That is why I have maintained distance whenever possible. Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting both hands on the table now. And what happens if you stop avoiding me? The Queen's gaze held his with absolute honesty. Then the instinct becomes impossible to ignore. Daniel Carter listened to the Queen's words, and for the first time since the conversation began, he felt the quiet weight behind them. The chamber remained silent except for the distant hum of Aurora Station's life support systems and the slow electrical murmur coming from the massive gas giant below the observation window. Daniel kept his hands resting on the table, studying Lysara carefully. The glow beneath her blue skin had not faded. If anything, it had grown steadier, faint silver currents moving slowly along her arms and shoulders, as if her body itself was reacting to the conversation. Daniel finally spoke again in the same calm tone he had used since entering the room. So for the past 3 days you have been reorganizing your entire diplomatic schedule, because standing within 30 feet of me triggers this instinct. The Queen gave a small nod. That is correct. Daniel let out a slow breath and leaned back slightly, processing the situation the way he would process any unfamiliar problem. When you deal with new species often enough, you learn not to assume human rules apply everywhere. Biology across the galaxy was complicated. Still, something about this explanation bothered him. He tilted his head slightly. I have met many members of your species during previous diplomatic assignments, and none of them reacted to me this way. Lysara did not seem surprised by the observation. That is because the bond instinct does not activate for most individuals. It requires a very specific biological compatibility. Daniel raised one eyebrow again. So the odds of this happening between two random individuals from completely different species are probably extremely low. The Queen nodded again, her expression thoughtful. Based on our current genetic models, the probability is extraordinarily small. Daniel gave a quiet half laugh under his breath. Of course it is. For a moment, he walked a few steps toward the observation window and looked down at the massive blue planet below them. From this height, the storms on the surface looked almost peaceful, even though each cloud formation stretched for thousands of miles. The scale of it reminded him how strange the universe could be. After a moment, he turned back toward the Queen. "All right," he said. "Let us assume for the moment that your biological explanation is correct. What exactly does this instinct do?" Lasara did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer to the table again, the distance between them shrinking slightly more than before. Daniel noticed that the silver light beneath her skin brightened again with that movement. "The instinct," she said quietly, "creates a powerful drive to remain close to the compatible individual." Daniel nodded slowly. "A kind of attachment response." "Yes, but stronger." The Queen's voice carried a tone that suggested the word stronger did not fully explain the situation. Daniel crossed his arms thoughtfully. "And you are concerned that if you allow the instinct to develop further, it could interfere with your responsibilities as a ruler." Lasara's golden eyes remained locked on his. "That is one concern." Daniel noticed the way she phrased the answer. "One concern, which means there are others," he said. The Queen hesitated for the first time since they entered the chamber. The faint silver glow across her skin pulsed once before settling again. "Yes, there are others." Daniel waited patiently. Finally, Lasara spoke again, her voice softer than before. "For my species, the bond instinct is not temporary. Once it fully activates, it becomes permanent." Daniel felt a quiet realization settle into place. "So if you stop avoiding me," he said slowly, "your biology will eventually treat me as something extremely important to you." The Queen met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes." Daniel folded his arms again and studied her expression carefully. "Then I think the real question is not why you were avoiding me." The Queen tilted her head slightly. "And what question do you believe matters more?" Daniel gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Whether you still intend to keep avoiding me now that we both understand the reason." Daniel Carter's question hung quietly in the council chamber, the words lingering in the air between them like something heavier than simple conversation. Outside the observation window, the immense blue gas giant continued its slow rotation beneath Aurora Station. Clouds the size of continents drifting across its surface, while distant lightning flickered silently thousands of miles below. Lasara did not answer immediately. The Queen remained standing across the circular table, her tall figure illuminated by the soft chamber lights, while faint silver currents continued to move beneath her blue skin. Daniel had begun to recognize that glow now. It appeared whenever the subject of their strange biological connection moved closer to the truth. He remained calm, leaning lightly against the edge of the table, arms folded while he watched her consider the question. "Whether you still intend to keep avoiding me now that we both understand the reason." Lasara's golden eyes held his steadily. For the first time since he had met her, the expression on her face carried something that looked almost human. Not fear, not authority, but uncertainty. After several seconds, she walked slowly toward the observation window and rested one hand against the transparent surface, looking down at the massive planet below them. The distance between them grew to nearly 20 feet again, as if the movement had been an unconscious attempt to regain control of the space between their bodies. "My original intention," she said quietly, "was to avoid activating the instinct entirely." Daniel nodded slightly. "That would explain the strategic retreats." "Yes." Lasara turned her head slightly so she could still see him from the corner of her eye. "If distance is maintained long enough, the biological response eventually weakens." Daniel pushed himself away from the table and walked slowly toward the center of the chamber, stopping roughly halfway between her and the door. "And now that you have explained it to me," he asked, "do you still believe distance will solve the problem?" The Queen studied him silently for a moment. The glow beneath her skin brightened again, faint silver light flowing along her collarbone and down her arms. "The honest answer," she said, "is that distance is no longer the primary concern." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Then what is?" Lasara turned fully to face him again. "The problem now is awareness." Daniel waited for her to continue. "My species evolved this instinct as a survival mechanism," she explained. "It ensures that when a compatible individual appears, the bond is not ignored. The instinct becomes stronger the longer the two individuals remain aware of one another." Daniel let out a quiet breath. "So now that we have had this conversation, the biological process is already moving forward." Lasara gave a small nod. Yes. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck thoughtfully and glanced once toward the enormous planet outside the window. That is inconvenient timing. The Queen's expression softened slightly in a way that almost resembled amusement. Inconvenient is an appropriate description. Daniel looked back at her. Let me ask something practical then. If the instinct becomes permanent once it fully activates, what exactly does that mean for your species? Lasara hesitated again before answering. It means that the compatible individual becomes the center of our long-term biological and emotional priorities. Daniel stared at her for a moment. In other words, he said slowly, your instincts would treat me as someone extremely important in your life. Yes. Daniel folded his arms again and considered that answer carefully. Then he asked the one question that had quietly formed in his mind the moment she mentioned permanence. And if that happens, what exactly does your empire think about its queen forming that kind of bond with a human security officer from Earth? Daniel Carter's question lingered in the chamber like a quiet ripple across still water. The enormous blue planet outside the window continued its slow, endless rotation, but inside the council room, everything felt strangely suspended in time. Queen Lasara did not answer immediately. She remained standing near the observation window with one hand resting lightly against the transparent surface, her golden eyes fixed on the swirling clouds far below the station. For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of Aurora Station's environmental systems circulating air through the chamber. Daniel waited patiently. In his experience, the most honest answers often took the longest to form. Finally, Lasara spoke without turning around. My empire would not understand it. Daniel nodded slightly, though she could not see the gesture from where she stood. That was more or less what he expected. Interstellar politics tended to be complicated even under normal circumstances. The ruler of a powerful alien civilization forming a permanent biological bond with a human security officer was not exactly a scenario most governments prepared for. Lasara slowly turned away from the window and faced him again. The faint silver currents beneath her blue skin had not faded. If anything, the glow appeared steadier now, moving in slow patterns along her arms and shoulders, as if her body had accepted something her mind was still analyzing. For my people, she continued, the bond instinct is considered sacred. Daniel raised one eyebrow slightly. Sacred is a strong word. It is meant to be. The Queen walked slowly back toward the circular table, stopping several feet away from him again. Our history records that this instinct guided the earliest social structures of our civilization. Families, alliances, and leadership lines were shaped by it long before we developed advanced technology. Daniel crossed his arms thoughtfully. So ignoring the instinct would go against your cultural traditions. Yes. Lasara's voice remained calm, but carried a quiet certainty behind it. For most of our history, individuals who attempted to suppress the bond instinct experienced severe psychological strain. Daniel gave a small half-smile. That sounds like evolution, making sure people did not argue with it. The Queen tilted her head slightly, acknowledging the observation. That is an accurate interpretation. Daniel studied her expression carefully. Then he asked the obvious question. If your culture respects this instinct so strongly, why were you trying so hard to avoid it? Lasara did not hesitate this time. Because I am not only an individual. I am also a ruler. Daniel nodded slowly. And rulers do not get to make purely personal decisions. Precisely. The Queen's golden eyes held his steadily now. Every action I take reflects upon my empire. Forming a permanent bond with someone from another species, especially one outside our political structure, would cause considerable uncertainty among my advisors. Daniel leaned lightly against the table again, considering the situation from a practical angle. I imagine the headlines across your star systems would be interesting. That earned the smallest hint of amusement in Lasara's expression. Interesting would be a polite description. Daniel looked toward the observation window again before returning his attention to her. Let me make sure I understand the situation from your perspective. Your biology is telling you that forming a bond with me is natural. Your culture says the instinct should be respected. But your responsibilities as a queen make the decision politically complicated. Lasara nodded once. That is correct. Daniel took a slow breath and then gave a quiet, thoughtful shrug. While that sounds like one of those problems the universe creates simply to see what people will do next. The Queen studied him for a moment, curious about the calm way he had summarized a situation that could easily reshape interstellar politics. Then she asked softly, "And what would you do if you were in my position?" Daniel thought about that for exactly 3 seconds before answering. Honestly, Lasara inclined her head slightly. Always. Daniel met her golden eyes without hesitation. I would probably start by asking whether the instinct is only affecting you or whether it is affecting me too. Queen Lasara did not answer Daniel Carter's question immediately. The words seemed to linger in the quiet council chamber, as if the room itself was waiting for the response. Outside the observation window, the immense blue gas giant continued its endless rotation, clouds stretching thousands of miles across its surface, while faint flashes of lightning flickered deep within the atmosphere. Daniel remained leaning lightly against the circular table, arms folded in a relaxed posture, watching the Queen carefully. For someone who commanded fleets and governed entire star systems, Lasara suddenly looked thoughtful in a way that felt almost personal rather than political. The faint silver glow beneath her blue skin moved slowly across her arms again, the pattern brightening slightly as she stepped closer to the table. Her golden eyes studied him with an intensity that suggested she was measuring more than his words. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but quieter than before. "That is a question my advisors did not anticipate." Daniel gave a small half-smile. Advisors rarely anticipate human questions. Lasara regarded him for a moment before continuing. "The bond instinct is primarily biological for my species. It is triggered by chemical and neurological compatibility that our bodies recognize instinctively. Humans do not share the same evolutionary mechanism." Daniel nodded slowly. "So technically, I might not feel anything unusual at all." "That is possible." The Queen paused again, the glow along her collarbone pulsing faintly before settling into a steady shimmer. However, she continued, compatibility signals do not always flow in only one direction. Daniel straightened slightly. "Meaning?" Lasara folded her hands together loosely in front of her. "In certain rare cases, the neurological interaction between two species can create emotional or psychological responses even if the biological instinct exists in only one of them." Daniel thought about that for a moment. "In other words," he said carefully, "my brain might start reacting simply because I am aware that your species sees me as important. That is one potential outcome." Daniel glanced briefly toward the window before looking back at her again. "Well, that explains why the situation feels a little surreal already." The Queen tilted her head slightly, studying him again. "Do you feel anything unusual when you are near me?" Daniel considered the question honestly. The chamber was quiet enough that he could hear the faint hum of the station's structural systems through the walls. After a moment, he answered with the same calm sincerity he had used throughout the conversation. "I feel curious." Lasara blinked once, clearly not expecting that answer. "Curious?" "Yes." Daniel uncrossed his arms and rested both hands on the table again. "Most people panic when they discover a situation that could change their life. I usually start by asking questions." The Queen's expression softened slightly as she listened. "And what questions are you asking now?" Daniel met her golden gaze directly. "The main one is simple. If your biology and your culture both say this bond matters, then maybe the real question is not whether it affects me. Maybe the real question is whether we are supposed to ignore it just because the politics are inconvenient." Lasara remained silent for a moment, absorbing the calm logic in his voice. Then she stepped a little closer again, the distance between them shrinking until only the circular table separated them. The silver light beneath her skin brightened softly as she spoke the next words. "That is precisely the question I have been asking myself since the moment I first saw you on this station." The quiet words from Queen Lasara settled over the chamber like the final piece of a puzzle neither of them had expected to solve that day. Daniel Carter remained standing on the opposite side of the circular table, watching the alien Queen with the same steady calm that had carried him through every strange moment since their first encounter on Aurora Station. Outside the wide observation window, the enormous blue gas giant continued to turn beneath the station, storms rolling across its atmosphere in slow patterns that had existed long before either of them had been born. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was no longer awkward. It felt thoughtful. Daniel studied the faint silver glow moving beneath Lasara's skin, the gentle light flowing across her shoulders and arms like distant starlight underwater. When he first noticed the glow, it had seemed mysterious and unfamiliar. Now he understood what it represented. Her body responding to something older than politics or diplomacy. Lasara stepped around the circular table slowly, closing the distance between them by a few feet. Daniel noticed that she was no longer measuring every step with the same careful restraint she had shown earlier. The instinct she had described was clearly still there, but now it seemed less like something she was fighting and more like something she had accepted. When she stopped again, they stood only a few feet apart, close enough that Daniel could see the subtle details of her expression. The golden color of her eyes reflected the chamber lights, and for the first time since they met, those eyes no longer looked conflicted. They looked certain. "Human Daniel Carter," she said quietly, "my people believe the bond instinct exists for a reason." Daniel nodded slightly. "Most instincts do." Lasara inclined her head in agreement. "For thousands of years our civilization trusted that instinct to guide decisions that shaped families, alliances, and even leadership. Ignoring it would mean rejecting a fundamental part of who we are." Daniel leaned lightly against the edge of the table again, considering her words with the same practical perspective he had used throughout the conversation. And following it would mean explaining to an entire empire why their queen suddenly decided that a human security officer is important to her life. The faintest hint of amusement touched Lasara's expression. "That explanation will certainly create many interesting discussions among my advisors." Daniel gave a quiet laugh under his breath. "That is one way to describe it." For a few seconds they both looked toward the observation window, where the blue planet continued its slow, silent rotation. Then Daniel spoke again. "Earlier you asked me whether the instinct affects me too." Lasara turned her gaze back to him. "Yes." Daniel considered his answer carefully before giving it. "I do not have the same biology your species does, but I do understand something about instincts." The queen listened without interrupting. Daniel folded his arms loosely and looked directly into her golden eyes. "When someone spends 3 days trying to avoid you because they believe your presence matters that much, eventually curiosity turns into respect. And respect," he added calmly, "is a pretty powerful instinct for humans." Lasara studied him for a long moment, the soft silver light beneath her skin brightening slightly again. Then she gave a small nod, as if confirming a decision she had been considering since the moment their paths first crossed. "In that case," she said quietly, "perhaps the universe did not place us on the same station by accident." Daniel glanced once more at the massive planet outside the window before returning his attention to the alien queen standing only a few feet away. He gave a thoughtful half-smile. "The universe does have a strange sense of timing." Lasara's gaze remained steady on his as the faint glow beneath her skin continued to shimmer softly in the quiet chamber. For the first time since arriving on Aurora Station, neither of them moved away.